Welcome back, everyone. Last live, we built this entire aircraft from scratch. It was all about modeling. Today, we're moving to the part that almost every artist loves to hate: UV unwrapping. I know, it's repetitive. It isn't the most exciting stage of game art. But here's the thing, great textures start with great UVs. Even if you're amazing at Substance Painter, poor UVs will make your texturing experience frustrating. So today, I'll show you my complete workflow, explain why I'm making each decision, share a few production tricks, and hopefully make this process a little less painful. Let's jump in. Before we start unwrapping, I'm going to delete half of the aircraft. Now, if you're wondering why we're deleting our own work, don't worry, we're not losing anything. Since this aircraft is symmetrical, both sides are identical. There's no point spending time creating UVs twice. We'll unwrap one side first, then duplicate it later inside Blender. This saves time and also keeps both sides perfectly identical. Sometimes beginners unwrap both sides separately and end up with different texel density or slightly different seam placement. Avoiding that saves a lot of cleanup later. So let's delete half for now. Next, I'm assigning a single material to every part. Why?
Because later, when exporting and moving between software, it's much cleaner. It also keeps everything organized before we begin texturing. It's a tiny step, but one that saves headaches later. For UVs, I'm using Rism UV, but don't worry if you don't have it. Everything we're doing today can also be done inside Blender. The concepts are exactly the same. Only the shortcuts and interface are different. Before we begin, here's a quick overview of the shortcuts I'll be using frequently. C to cut seams, U to unwrap, P to pack UVs, F2 for edge mode, F3 for face mode, F4 for mesh selection mode. Once you know these few shortcuts, the workflow becomes much faster. I'm starting with the flat meshes first. Why these? Because they usually don't need seams at all. Flat surfaces often unwrap perfectly without extra cuts, so they're the easiest pieces to finish first. Getting these out of the way also makes the remaining work feel much smaller. After unwrapping each one, I'm hiding it using the H key. This is one of my favorite habits. Instead of staring at hundreds of finished pieces, I only see what's left to do. It keeps the viewport clean and helps me stay focused. Now we're getting to the important part, placing seams. Remember, seams aren't random cuts. I'm placing them according to how I want to texture this model later inside Substance Painter. Think ahead. If I know I want to paint certain panels or details separately, I want those UV islands separated as well. Planning for texturing now makes painting much easier later. A common beginner mistake is placing seams wherever they fit, without thinking about the texturing stage. Future you will not appreciate that. To speed things up, I'm simply double-clicking an edge to select the entire edge loop. Much faster than selecting every edge manually. After unwrapping, I'm straightening the UV islands whenever possible. Why bother? Straight UVs waste less space, pack better, and are much easier to paint on. Your texture resolution is limited, so every little bit of UV space matters. Cleaner UVs usually mean sharper textures. You'll notice I'm not creating UVs for these two parts. That's intentional. Later, I'll simply copy another identical piece and replace these inside Blender. Since they're identical geometry, there's no reason to unwrap them twice. This is one of those small optimizations that really adds up on larger projects. Just remember to delete the extra one in Blender. It's a very easy thing to forget, especially after working for a long time. Here's another nice time-saving trick. Instead of cutting seams one object at a time, we can select similar edges across multiple meshes and cut all of them together. Small workflow improvements like this save a surprising amount of time over an entire project. Now I'm selecting similar UV islands and stacking them. By stacking them, both objects share the exact same texture. That gives us much better UV efficiency and allows more texture resolution for unique parts. Just remember, only stack parts that are actually identical. Otherwise, you'll end up painting one object and accidentally changing another. Sometimes you'll notice I unwrap something one way, and then a few minutes later, I find a better solution. That's completely normal. UV unwrapping isn't always about getting everything perfect on the first try. Professional artists constantly adjust their workflow while they work. Don't be afraid to improve things halfway through. If we discover any hidden or unnecessary meshes during the process, we can safely delete them after the UVs are finished. There's no reason to keep geometry that nobody will ever see. Cleaner models are easier to manage. Honestly, one of the most satisfying moments in UV work is when every mesh disappears because you've hidden everything after unwrapping. You suddenly look at the viewport and realize, I'm almost done. It's like crossing the finish line of the most repetitive part of the project. Now, everything is unwrapped. Let's unhide everything. Select all, press P, and pack the UVs. Packing is important because we want to use as much of the texture space as possible. Better packing means higher texture quality. Before leaving Rhizome UV, always do one final check. Look for overlaps. Look for meshes that somehow never got unwrapped. This quick inspection can save hours later. You'll notice these parts weren't unwrapped. That's expected. Remember earlier when I skipped them? Now we're simply deleting them because we'll replace them inside Blender. Exactly as planned. Let's jump back into Blender. Import the updated UVs. Now I'm selecting the missing pieces. A quick shortcut here, just hover over the mesh and press L. That selects the linked geometry instantly. Delete those pieces. Now duplicate the already unwrapped version and move it into the correct location. Much faster than creating new UVs. If necessary, we can also adjust the object's origin point so everything behaves correctly. Before exporting, I'm checking for UV overlaps one final check. At first glance, you might think something is wrong. But remember, earlier we intentionally stacked identical parts. Those overlaps are supposed to exist. They're not mistakes. The important thing is making sure there aren't any unexpected overlaps elsewhere.
Knowing the difference between intentional and accidental overlaps is an important production skill. Everything looks good. Now I'm combining all the objects using Ctrl+J. Then I apply all transforms. This is another step beginners often skip. Applying transforms helps avoid scaling and rotation problems inside other software, like Substance Painter or game engines. Finally, I'll rename the mesh properly. Never leave assets with names like cube.014. Future you and anyone working with you will appreciate clean naming. Now, export everything as an FBX, texturing. This is where the model really starts coming to life. Up until now, we've only been working with shapes and forms, but from this point onward, we're going to add personality, wear, materials, and all those little details that make the aircraft feel believable. Let's jump into Substance Painter, and our aircraft is officially ready for the texturing stage. All right, now that our model is ready, it's time for one of my favorite parts of the entire workflow. Go to File, click New, select your mesh, and before doing anything else, make sure to bake your mesh maps. Baking is one of those steps that beginners sometimes rush through, but it's actually the foundation for almost every smart material, mask, and procedural effect we'll be using later. If the bake isn't clean, you'll spend hours trying to fix problems that actually started right here. Once the baking is finished, take a moment to inspect your model. Rotate it from every angle and check for any baking artifacts, strange gradients, or projection issues. Thankfully, in this project, everything baked perfectly, so we don't have to spend extra time fixing anything. And that's always a good feeling. Now we're ready to start texturing. Before we go any further though, don't forget to save your project. Trust me, Substance Painter is an amazing tool, but every artist has at least one story about losing hours of work because they forgot to save.
Hopefully today won't become one of those stories. For this project, I'm changing the shader to PBR Metallic Roughness with Alpha Blend. Then I'll increase the specular quality from 16 to 32. This gives us a nicer viewport preview, especially when we're working with metallic surfaces and subtle roughness variations. It doesn't magically improve the texture itself, but it definitely makes evaluating the material much easier. As the base, I'm using the plastic dusty material. You don't have to use the exact same material I'm using here. Feel free to experiment if you're going for a different style or story. The important thing at this stage isn't choosing the perfect material. It's creating a solid starting point that we can build on throughout the tutorial. Now I'm adjusting the metalness and roughness values to get the overall surface closer to the look I have in mind. At the same time, I'm slightly reducing the opacity of the dirt edges because I don't want that effect to overpower the base material. Small adjustments like these often make a surprisingly big difference. Finally, I'm tweaking the base color a little until it feels right. By the way, I'm curious, which renderer do you usually preview your textures in? Do you mostly stay inside Substance Painter, or do you prefer checking everything in Blender or Marmoset? Let me know in the comments. It's always interesting to see everyone's workflow. Now that we have a clean base, let's start breaking up the materials. I'm going to duplicate the base layer, add a black mask, and then add a paint effect. This layer will be used to manually paint the mirror material exactly where I want it. Working with masks like this gives us complete control, and more importantly, it's completely non-destructive. If we change our mind later, we can simply paint the mask differently instead of rebuilding the material from scratch. To make the process faster, I'm enabling symmetry. Just adjust the symmetry settings until everything lines up correctly with your model. Don't worry if it isn't perfect on the first try. Sometimes symmetry depends on how the model was exported, so spend a few seconds making sure both sides are painting correctly before continuing. Once everything is aligned, I simply paint the material onto the parts where I want that mirror finish. Now I want another variation. So instead of creating everything from scratch again, I'm duplicating this material. I'll remove the previous black mask and the old paint effect, then add a fresh mask and a new paint layer. This lets me reuse all the material settings while painting completely different areas. It's much faster than rebuilding the entire material every time. I'll slightly change the color so it feels like a different painted surface, then start selecting the parts where I want this new variation. You'll notice me duplicating layers quite often throughout this project. That's intentional. Reusing existing layers keeps the workflow consistent, saves time, and makes future adjustments much easier because all the materials already share similar settings. Once again, I'll duplicate the material, remove the old mask, create a new one, adjust the color slightly, and then paint it onto another set of meshes. This time I'm going with more of a burgundy, slightly rustic color. Don't worry too much about choosing the perfect color immediately. One of the biggest advantages of working non-destructively is that we can always come back later and fine-tune every color in just a few seconds. So don't get stuck trying to make everything perfect during the first pass.
At this stage, we're mainly establishing the overall color distribution across the aircraft. Another helpful tip is that Substance Painter gives us several different selection modes. We can select using UVs, meshes, or faces, depending on what makes the job easier. Sometimes selecting directly in the 2D view is much faster than trying to click tiny polygons in the 3D viewport, especially when you're working with complex models. You'll also see me using the pen tool to paint additional details. Of course, the regular brush works perfectly fine too, but using paint effects inside masks gives us a much more flexible, non-destructive workflow. That's something you'll hear me emphasize quite a bit throughout this tutorial because it makes editing so much easier later. Now I'm duplicating the base material again, and this time I'm making a few subtle adjustments to both the color and the metalness before painting it onto a new set of parts. You'll notice that most of my changes here are actually very small, and that's intentional. One mistake beginners often make is making every material look completely different.
In reality, especially on something like an aircraft, most painted metal surfaces belong to the same family of materials. Small variations usually look much more believable than dramatic ones. Another thing I'd recommend is limiting your color palette. Personally, I like sticking to 2 or 3 main colors for a model like this. Once you start introducing too many colors, the design can quickly become distracting and lose its visual identity. Keeping the palette simple helps the viewer's eye focus on the overall design, instead of jumping between random colors. So for now, I'm only blocking out the main colors. Don't worry about scratches, dirt, decals, or tiny details yet. We'll come back and layer those on later. It's much easier to build detail on top of a strong foundation than it is to fix a messy base. Here's a small shortcut that makes masking much easier. If you Alt plus left click on the mask, Substance Painter will display the mask itself instead of the material. This makes it much easier to see exactly where you've painted and where you haven't. It's a tiny feature, but once you start using it, you'll probably never stop. Now I'm duplicating the material again, adjusting the metalness and roughness values and applying it to these 2 tires. Since the material's already very close to what I need, duplicating it is much faster than creating another layer from scratch. Next, I'm tweaking the rust effect a little. Right now it's looking a bit too strong for my taste.
Rust is one of those effects that's really easy to overdo. It's tempting to crank it up because it looks cool. But if every surface is heavily rusted, the entire model starts feeling unrealistic. Instead, I just reduce the intensity until it feels more natural. Sometimes less really is more. Now I'm importing a custom alpha texture, and this is where we can start introducing some unique surface details that aren't available in the default materials. I'll create a new fill layer, add a black mask, and then add a fill effect inside that mask. From there, it's as simple as dragging and dropping Alpha 2 into the fill effect. A quick organizational tip before we continue: rename your layers.
I know, it's probably the least exciting part of texturing. Nobody opens Substance Painter thinking, today I'm gonna have so much fun naming layers. But after 50 or 60 layers, you'll be incredibly thankful that you spent those extra few seconds organizing everything. Future you will definitely appreciate it. Now, I also want this alpha to interact with the existing rust, so I'll move this layer below the rust layer and add an anchor point. Anchor points are incredibly powerful because they allow different layers to communicate with each other. Instead of rebuilding masks over and over again, we can simply reference information that's already been created elsewhere in the layer stack. On the base material, I'm adding another curvature generator. Inside its settings,
I'll enable micro normals and micro height, then select the anchor point we just created. This allows the rust generator to react to the details coming from our alpha, instead of treating everything as a completely flat surface.
it's a really smart workflow because every time we update the alpha, the rust updates automatically as well. That's why I always recommend learning anchor points early. They might seem confusing at first, but once they click, you'll wonder how you ever textured without them. Now I'll spend a little time adjusting the settings until the rust starts reacting the way I want. There's honestly no magic number here. This part is mostly experimentation. Try changing the balance, the contrast, or the intensity a little at a time and watch how the result changes. Texturing is often less about following exact numbers and more about developing an eye for what looks believable. Out of curiosity, have you started using anchor points in your own projects yet? Or do they still feel a little confusing? Let me know in the comments. They're one of those features that almost every Substance Painter artist struggles with initially, but once you understand them, they completely change the way you build materials.
And repeating exactly the same workflow with another alpha texture. Since we've already built the setup once, recreating it takes almost no time. I'll remove a few unwanted areas,
add the effect to some new sections, and continue refining the overall look. Again, because everything is non-destructive, we're never locking ourselves into a decision. If we decide tomorrow that this alpha would look better somewhere else, all we have to do is repaint the mask instead of rebuilding the material. That's one of the biggest reasons I love this workflow. We're always editing, never starting over. One thing I really like about working inside the mask is that it's much easier to see exactly where the alpha has been applied. Instead of trying to judge everything through the final material, the mask gives you a clear black and white representation of the affected areas. That makes refining your selections much quicker and helps you spot mistakes before they become noticeable in the final texture. Now I'm adjusting the global balance and contrast to fine-tune the alpha. These two settings can completely change the look of the same texture, so don't be afraid to experiment. Sometimes a tiny adjustment is all it takes to transform an average-looking detail into something that blends naturally with the rest of the model. Next, I'm reducing the opacity of this curvature effect just a little. Right now, it's influencing the surface a bit too much, so dialing it back helps keep the details subtle. At the same time, I'm introducing a little color variation and making small adjustments to the metalness and roughness. Those tiny material changes are what stop the surface from feeling perfectly uniform. Real-world objects almost never have identical roughness everywhere, so even slight variation can make a huge difference. Here, I'm adding a blur filter. The reason is simple. Some of these edges are looking a little too sharp.
Procedural effects often create crisp transitions, but in reality, paint wear and surface damage are rarely that perfect. A slight blur softens those transitions and helps everything blend together much more naturally. Oops, looks like I accidentally selected a few extra faces. No problem. This is exactly why I like working non-destructively. Instead of deleting layers or rebuilding anything, I can simply go back into the mask and remove those unwanted faces. Mistakes like this happen all the time, even after years of using the software, so don't worry if you catch yourself doing the same thing. In fact, if you're struggling to select those tiny faces in the 3D viewport, switching over to the 2D view usually makes the job much easier. Sometimes the simplest solution is just changing your perspective. Now I'm replacing a few of the existing materials and selecting a different group of faces. To create another variation, I'll duplicate the base material again, adjust the color slightly, remove the old paint effect, and add a fresh one. Since the material properties are already close to what I need, this is much faster than creating an entirely new material from scratch. I'm also duplicating the alpha layer. Just like before, I'll remove the old paint effect, add a new one, reposition the alpha, adjust its location, scale, and rotation if needed, then paint only the areas where I want this detail to appear. If there are places where I don't want the alpha, I'll simply deselect them through the mask. You'll notice that I keep switching between UV selection
And face selection throughout the project. That's completely normal. Different situations call for different selection methods, and part of becoming faster in Substance Painter is knowing when to switch between them, instead of forcing yourself to use only one. Now I'll add another anchor point to this layer. Just like earlier, I want the rust to react to this new alpha as well. So I'll add another curvature generator to the rust layer and reference this anchor point through micronormals and microheight. This creates a much stronger relationship between our surface details and the weathering effects. Instead of the rust looking like it's floating randomly on top, it actually starts respecting the height information we've created. Those little interactions are what make procedural texturing feel much more believable. For this variation, I'm trying a completely different alpha. Sometimes the first alpha works perfectly. Sometimes it doesn't, and that's completely okay. I'll adjust the levels until I get sharper details that better fit this particular area. Remember, every alpha behaves differently, so don't expect the exact same settings to work every time. Now I'm creating another fill layer, adding a black mask, and this time using a curvature generator. I'll tweak the color, the metalness, and the roughness to create some subtle edge highlights. This helps break up the large flat surfaces and gives the material a little more depth. Originally, I tried using the mask editor here. After looking at the result, honestly, I wasn't happy with it. So I removed it and went back to using curvature instead. But after experimenting a little more, I actually changed my mind and added the mask editor back. And I want to point something out here because it's an important lesson. Professional texturing isn't about getting everything right on the first try. It's about testing ideas, comparing results, and choosing the version that looks best. Don't think of changing your mind as making mistakes. Think of it as exploring better solutions. One of the biggest advantages of a non-destructive workflow is exactly this. You always have the freedom to go back. You're never locked into a decision. Now I'll make a few more adjustments to the color. Next, I'll duplicate this layer once again. This time I'm using the mask editor while reducing the metalness a little and adjusting its properties to create a subtle rusty tint. Then I'll duplicate that layer again and introduce some dirt cavities. At first, the cavity effect is much stronger than I actually want.
So instead of removing it completely, I'll simply reduce the intensity. Remember,
Viewers usually notice believable materials because of subtle details, not because every effect is turned up to 100%. I'm lowering the opacity quite a bit, reducing the amount of detail, and introducing some randomness. Tiny variations like these stop procedural effects from looking repetitive. To build on that, I'll duplicate the layer again, shift the color slightly, and create another variation. Layering multiple subtle effects almost always produces a more natural result than relying on one aggressive effect. Now let's add something a little more interesting. I'm creating another fill layer, and this time I'm enabling emission. Since I only want the emission in specific places, I'll add a black mask and almost said fill effect, but in this case I'll use a paint effect, so I can manually select the mesh. I'm painting the emission onto the front section of the aircraft, where I want those illuminated details to appear. It's a small addition, but little accents like this can make the final render much more eye-catching, especially once we move into Marmoset and start setting up the lighting. By the way, what's your favorite part of the texturing process? Is it creating the base materials, painting wear and tear, adding decals, or setting up those final presentation renders? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to know which stage you enjoy the most. Now I'm duplicating the alpha layer and placing it exactly where I want this effect to appear. I'll tweak the color just a little, and then I'll swap this alpha for a different one. Don't be afraid to test different alphas throughout your project.
Sometimes an alpha that doesn't work at all in one area ends up looking perfect somewhere else. That's why I rarely settle for the first option I try. Since I've changed the alpha, I also need to update the rust interaction. I'll remove the previous curvature, add a new curvature generator, and this time I'll reference the anchor point from this new alpha layer.
After that, it's just a matter of adjusting the global balance and contrast until the rust starts following the new surface details naturally. I'll also add a slight blur filter. Nothing too strong, just enough to soften those transitions. Remember, we're trying to make these details feel like they've existed on the surface for years, not like they were stamped on 5 minutes ago. At this point, I'm really focusing on building up that worn, slightly weathered look. To add a little more personality, I'm using the pen tool to paint some custom details. One reason I prefer doing this with paint effects instead of painting directly is because it keeps everything editable. If I decide later that I don't like a shape or want to move it somewhere else, I can simply edit the mask instead of repainting everything from scratch. That's one of the biggest themes you'll notice throughout this tutorial. Always try to keep your workflow flexible. Your future self will thank you. Now I'm creating another fill effect, and inside that I'm adding a grunge alpha. This layer is mainly there to introduce some subtle randomness across the surface. Perfectly clean procedural textures can sometimes feel a little artificial, so adding a bit of controlled imperfection helps break up that uniform look. I'll adjust the scale, balance, and other parameters until the grunge feels natural. Since this fill layer affects the entire masked area, it's a great way to add variation without manually painting every little detail. Next, I'm adding another paint effect. This time, I'll manually select only the areas where I actually want this grunge to appear. This gives me much more artistic control compared to letting the texture affect everything equally. If the brush size feels too large or too small, simply adjust it as you work. Don't hesitate to change it frequently. Different parts of the model often require different brush sizes, and constantly adapting your brush is part of an efficient workflow. I also don't like how rounded this particular alpha looks, so I'm replacing it with a square-shaped alpha instead. Immediately, the design starts feeling more mechanical, which suits this aircraft much better.
Now I'm creating another paint effect and adding these square details. Here's another workflow tip that I use all the time. Instead of putting every painted detail inside one paint effect, create multiple paint effects for different design elements. It might seem unnecessary at first, but later, if you decide you only want to edit one group of details, you'll be incredibly glad you separated them.
Otherwise, you'd have to edit one giant paint layer containing everything. Think of it like organizing your Blender scene. A little organization now saves a lot of frustration later. I'll also adjust the rotation, contrast, size, and other settings until everything feels balanced. Don't worry about matching my exact values. Your model might be different, your UV layout might be different, and your artistic direction might be different. Instead of copying numbers, try understanding why each adjustment is being made. That's a much more valuable skill.
Now I want another color variation using exactly the same painted design. Rather than painting everything again, I'll simply duplicate the layer, move it slightly, adjust the scale a little, and change the color. This creates extra visual interest while only taking a few seconds. You'll notice this duplication technique comes up again and again throughout professional texturing workflows because it's incredibly efficient. Next, I'm adding an HSL filter. I'll slightly shift the hue to experiment with different color variations. I don't necessarily know if this version will be better, I'm just exploring ideas. And that's something I'd really encourage you to do as well. Texturing isn't about finding the correct answer. It's about trying different possibilities until something feels right. Sometimes you'll change one slider, and suddenly the whole asset feels 10 times better. Other times, you'll undo the change immediately. Both outcomes are completely normal. Now I'm switching the viewport tone mapping from linear to ACES.
ACES usually provides a much more pleasing preview, especially when you're working with physically based materials. It gives you a better idea of how your textures might look inside a renderer later. I'll also increase the environment exposure by about 1 stop. Again, this is mainly for preview purposes. I'm briefly enabling the post-process effects so I can check the glare, but honestly, I don't want that effect while I'm actively texturing. Too much bloom can actually make it harder to judge your materials accurately. So after checking it, I'll simply disable it again. It's always a good idea to evaluate your textures under clean lighting first, before adding fancy viewport effects. Now I'm going back and adjusting the metalness again while checking the overall rust distribution. This is another habit I'd recommend building. Don't wait until the very end to review your materials. Constantly rotate the model. Zoom in, zoom out, look at it from different angles. Sometimes a material looks perfect from the front and completely wrong from the side. Regularly checking your work helps you catch those issues early. At this stage, I'm still experimenting with the colors, roughness, rust intensity, and alpha details. Nothing is locked yet. That's one of the reasons I enjoy working procedurally.
Everything stays editable until the very end. Finally, I'm taking another moment to rename a few more layers. I know, not the most exciting part of texturing, but trust me, once your layer stack grows beyond 100 layers, finding something called Fill Layer 47 Copy Final isn't exactly fun. Keeping everything organized is one of those habits that separates a comfortable workflow from a frustrating one. If you've ever opened an old project after 6 months and had absolutely no idea what your own layers were doing, congratulations. You're officially a substance painter artist. Let me know in the comments if that's ever happened to you. I promise you, you're definitely not the only one. Now, I'm creating another fill layer, but this time I don't want it affecting anything except the height channel. So I'll disable every other channel and leave only height enabled. This is a really useful technique because it lets us build surface details without accidentally changing the color, roughness, or any other material properties. Next, I'll add a black mask, followed by a paint effect, and inside that, I'll add a fill effect. This setup gives us complete control over where these height details appear while still keeping everything editable. For this design, I'm using a stripe alpha. I'll adjust the scale, size, and spacing until it fits nicely on the frame. Don't worry if it doesn't look perfect immediately. These values usually take a little tweaking depending on the scale of your model and your UV layout. To make the stripes feel a little sharper, I'm adding a levels filter. This lets me tighten the edges and control how crisp the height information appears. After that, I'll add a bevel filter. The bevel is subtle, but it helps create the illusion that these stripes are actually part of the surface instead of just being flat height information. Tiny details like this make a surprisingly big difference when light starts hitting the model.
I'll also add another levels filter after the bevel to fine-tune the overall height. Again, this isn't about making huge adjustments, just refining the result little by little. Finally, I'm adding a slight blur filter. Just like earlier, this helps soften those razor-sharp edges. In reality, very few manufactured details have perfectly sharp transitions, especially after they've been painted and weathered. Now I only want these stripes on the frame. I definitely don't want them running across the entire aircraft. So I'll add another paint effect and simply paint out the areas where I don't want the design. This is much easier than trying to build a perfect mask from the beginning. I'll remove the effect from most of the aircraft and keep it only around the frame and a little on the backside. This is another reason why I always recommend building your masks gradually instead of trying to make them perfect in one pass. As we continue refining the texture, it's much easier to adjust an existing mask than to completely rebuild it. Now, I also want these height details to interact with the rust. If you've been following along so far, you probably already know what's coming next. That's right, another anchor point. I'll add the anchor point to this layer and move the layer underneath the rust setup. Then I'll go back to the rust layer, add another curvature generator, enable micronormals and microheight, and reference this new anchor point. This tells the rust generator to recognize the height information we just created. Instead of rust ignoring these stripes, it now naturally wraps around them, making everything feel like it belongs together. These tiny interactions are what separate a flat procedural texture from something that feels much more believable. One important thing to remember here is the layer order.
Make sure the layer containing the anchor point is positioned correctly relative to the rust layer. If the order isn't right, the curvature generator won't receive the information you're expecting. If something doesn't seem to be working, before changing a dozen settings, always check the layer stack first. 9 times out of 10, the issue is simply the layer order.
Now I'm adding a few more height details. For this variation, I'm changing the alpha to a sharper hand-drawn style. The previous alpha worked well for broader details, but here I want something with slightly cleaner edges. Again, there's no single correct alpha. Different shapes create different visual languages. Some feel industrial. Some feel worn. Some feel futuristic. Choose whichever supports the story you're trying to tell.
As I paint these details, you'll notice that the rust automatically reacts to them. And that's exactly why we spent the extra time setting up those anchor points. We're getting all of this interaction automatically. If we later move these painted details, the rust updates too. No rebuilding, no repainting, everything stays connected.
Now I'm adding another paint effect instead of continuing inside the previous one. This is another organizational habit that's worth building. Every time I create a different design element, I usually create another paint effect. That way, if I decide tomorrow that I don't like just this particular design, I can edit or delete it without affecting everything else. Trying to squeeze every painted detail into one paint effect might seem faster today, but it usually creates a headache later. So here I'm creating some simple line designs. Nothing overly complicated, just enough to introduce a little more visual interest. Now I'll duplicate the entire height layer. This time, I'll remove the old effects and replace them with a different alpha. Using the brush tool, I'll paint another set of raised details, while increasing the height slightly. I'll also leave a little spacing between the elements. Giving details room to breathe often makes them stand out more than packing everything tightly together. Next, I'll add another bevel. If the bevel feels too strong, simply remove it or reduce it.
There's no rule saying every height detail needs one. Sometimes the clean version actually looks better.
I'll also experiment with adding another blur filter. Again, it's all about refining the transition. One workflow that gives surprisingly realistic results is using two separate height layers. One layer represents the deeper portion of the detail. The second layer represents the raised portion. For the depth layer, I'll apply a little more blur. For the height layer, I'll use less blur. That slight difference creates a much nicer shadow transition and makes the details feel far more dimensional than using a single layer alone. Here's a really important trick. Instead of repainting the design twice, simply copy the paint effect from one layer and paste it into the other. That way, both layers use the exact same painted mask.
Everything stays perfectly aligned. No guessing, no repainting, no tiny mismatches. It's one of those little workflow improvements that saves a surprising amount of time over the course of a large project. If I disable the depth layer, you'll immediately notice that the details become much flatter. Turning it back on restores that extra sense of depth. It's a subtle difference, but subtle differences are often what make a professional texture feel convincing. Once again, I'll add anchor points to both of these layers and connect them to the rust using another curvature generator. Yes, we're using anchor points a lot, but by now you can probably see why. They allow every new detail we create to automatically participate in the weathering process. That's exactly the kind of procedural workflow that makes Substance Painter so powerful. Now I'm making a few small color adjustments. Nothing dramatic, just refining the balance between the different materials. Then I'll continue adding more custom details using exactly the same workflow we've already built. Different alpha, different color, same non-destructive process. Once you understand the system, creating new variations becomes incredibly fast because you're no longer inventing a new workflow every time. You're simply building on top of the one you've already created. And that's a huge productivity boost when you're working on larger assets. Here we're also adding some of these details to the propellers. Even though they're relatively small compared to the rest of the aircraft, don't ignore them. Small components often end up close to the camera during beauty shots, so giving them the same level of attention helps maintain the overall quality of the asset. Consistency is what makes a model feel professionally finished.
Now I want to create a striped pattern around this ring. Rather than creating a brand new material, I'll simply add another paint effect and remove the previous mask. Since the underlying material is already working well, reusing it keeps everything consistent and saves quite a bit of time. At the moment, I'm leaving the middle section selected, but I'll deselect those faces in a moment. That way the stripe continues around the ring while keeping the center nice and clean. Small design decisions like this help guide the viewer's eye and stop the surface from becoming visually noisy. As always, don't hesitate to stop for a moment and inspect your work. Rotate the model. Zoom in. Zoom out. Look at it under different lighting angles. Sometimes you'll notice something that looked perfectly fine from one angle, but feels completely different from another. Building the habit of constantly reviewing your work is one of the easiest ways to improve your texturing quality.
Now I'm adding another curvature generator, but this time I'm giving it a slightly lighter color. The goal isn't to create strong edge wear, but to gently brighten some of the exposed edges. Real surfaces naturally catch more light on their edges.
So adding this subtle variation helps separate forms without making the effect look exaggerated. I'll tweak the parameters until the transition feels soft and natural. Remember, edge highlights should support the material, not become the first thing people notice. Next, I'm adding a fill effect, and for the texture, I'm choosing something like a cloud pattern or a dirt texture. Either one works, depending on the look you're after. I'll change the blending mode to multiply, which introduces some random breakup across the surface. This is another simple trick to reduce that perfectly clean procedural appearance. Nature rarely creates perfectly even surfaces. Neither does manufacturing. Even freshly painted objects usually have tiny inconsistencies that make them feel real. So adding controlled randomness like this helps the material feel much more believable. The dirt effect is a little stronger than I want, so I'm reducing it slightly. It's very easy for dirt to take over the entire material if you're not careful. I usually prefer adding just enough to be noticeable without making it the main focus.
Now I'm checking the textures in 4K. This is an important step because details that look great at lower resolutions sometimes reveal unexpected problems when viewed at full resolution.
Checking your work at the final texture size helps you catch stretched alphas, blurry masks, overly sharp details, or repetitive patterns before exporting.
Next, I'm adding another paint effect and placing some text details onto the model. These tiny decals do a lot for storytelling. Even if the viewer never reads them, they subconsciously make the asset feel more believable because they suggest maintenance markings, serial numbers, or manufacturer information. I'll adjust the size until they fit naturally on the surface. Instead of creating everything again for another color variation, I'll simply copy this paint effect and paste it into another color layer. This is another workflow optimization that saves a surprising amount of time. Since both layers are sharing the same painted mask, all I need to do is adjust the color and maybe swap the alpha to create a completely different variation. It's a simple trick, but it adds a nice amount of visual randomness without increasing the workload. Now I'm changing the alpha and adding a few more details.
Just like before, I'll create another anchor point and connect it to the rust using a curvature generator. By this point, you've probably noticed a pattern. Every new height or alpha detail gets connected through an anchor point, so the weathering system can react automatically. Once this setup is built, adding new details becomes incredibly efficient because everything naturally
Integrates into the existing material. I'll make a few small color adjustments, refine the balance between the different materials, and add some additional height details where the surface feels a little too flat.
Finally, I'll manually paint a little dirt using the brush tool. This is one of my favorite finishing steps. Procedural effects are fantastic for building a believable foundation, but manually placing a few imperfections gives the model that final handcrafted touch. Don't overdo it. Just a few carefully placed areas are usually enough. Sometimes a single brushstroke in the right place looks better than another 10 procedural layers. That's something you'll start developing an eye for with practice. If you've been following along from the beginning, take a second and compare what the model looks like now versus when we first imported it into Substance Painter. It's a completely different asset. And interestingly, most of that transformation didn't come from huge changes. It came from stacking lots of small, thoughtful decisions on top of each other. That's really what texturing is. Not one giant trick, but hundreds of tiny improvements working together. Finally, we're happy with the textures, so it's time to export everything and see how it looks in a proper rendering environment. Go ahead and export all the texture maps using your preferred export preset. Since this asset is going into Blender and then Marmoset, make sure you're exporting the maps that match your rendering workflow. Taking a few extra seconds to double-check the export settings now can save you from wondering later why something doesn't look right. Now let's jump back into Blender. The first thing I'm going to do is add a mirror modifier to one of these objects. Instead of manually adding the same modifier to every symmetrical object, Blender gives us a much faster workflow. Select all the objects that need the same mirror modifier. Now, make sure the object that already has the modifier is selected last, because that becomes the active object. Press Ctrl+L and choose Copy Modifiers. Just like that, Blender copies the modifier to every selected object. This is one of those shortcuts that can save a surprising amount of time, especially on larger projects with lots of repeated objects. If you've never used Ctrl+L before, definitely add it to your workflow. It's one of those hidden gems that many beginners don't discover until much later. Now that everything has the correct modifier, I'll apply all of them. After that, I'll also apply all transforms. This is another step that's easy to overlook, but it's extremely important before exporting. Leaving unapplied transforms can sometimes cause scaling issues, incorrect pivots, or unexpected problems once the model reaches another application. So I always make it a habit to apply everything before exporting. Once that's done, I'll combine the objects that need to be combined and export the final model as an FBX. Now it's time for my favorite part. Rendering. For this project, I'm using Marmoset Toolbag because it's incredibly fast for look development and presentation renders. I'll import the FBX and load all of the textures we exported from Substance Painter. As always, take a moment to verify that every texture is plugged into the correct slot. If something looks strange, don't immediately assume the texture is wrong. Sometimes it's simply connected to the wrong channel. Once everything is assigned correctly, the model should already look very close to what we had inside Substance Painter. Now let's start improving the presentation. Presentation is just as important as the asset itself.
You can spend weeks creating an amazing model, but if the lighting is poor,
people may never notice all the hard work you've put into it. So let's build a lighting setup that actually shows off the details we've spent hours creating. I'll select the camera and change the tone mapping to Aces. Aces usually produces a much more pleasing image with smoother highlights and richer colors, making it a great starting point for portfolio renders. Next comes the lighting. Rather than relying on a single bright light, I prefer building the scene using multiple lights with different purposes. I'll start with a primary key light that defines the overall direction of the lighting and creates the strongest highlights. Then I'll introduce a softer fill light to gently brighten the shadow areas without removing all the contrast. Finally, I'll add a rim light behind the aircraft. This light is incredibly useful because it separates the silhouette from the background and helps the shape read much more clearly. Even a subtle rim light can completely change how professional the render feels. As I'm adjusting each light, I'm constantly rotating around the model. Different angles reveal different reflections, and sometimes moving a light just a few degrees creates much nicer highlights across the surface. Don't just look at one camera angle. Orbit around the model and make sure the lighting works from multiple viewpoints. That's especially important if you're creating portfolio images or turntable animations. Another thing I always pay attention to is reflection. Metal materials come alive through reflections. If the reflections aren't interesting, the material usually isn't either.
Sometimes the solution isn't changing the material at all. It's simply improving the lighting that's reflecting on it. Now I'm adjusting the brightness of the lights until everything feels balanced. I'm trying to keep the brightest areas under control while still allowing the darker areas to retain enough information. Good lighting isn't about making everything bright. It's about directing the viewer's attention. Once I'm happy with the lighting, I'll make a few final image adjustments. I'll slightly tweak the saturation so the colors feel a little richer without becoming unrealistic. Then I'll adjust the contrast to help the forms read more clearly. Again, subtle adjustments. Small changes usually look much more natural than extreme edits. Now I'll choose the output resolution, depending on where the renders will be used. For ArtStation, portfolio work, or thumbnails, I usually prefer rendering at a higher resolution because it preserves all those small details we've worked so hard to create. Finally, I'll adjust the field of view. This is something many beginners overlook. A very wide field of view can distort the proportions of the model, while a very narrow one can make the render feel flat. Spend a little time finding a focal length that best represents your asset. Sometimes changing only the camera angle and field of view can completely transform the presentation without touching the model itself. Now I'll carefully frame the shot. I'm looking for an angle that clearly showcases the silhouette, highlights the interesting texture work, and creates a strong composition. Take your time here. The render is the first thing people will see. You've already spent hours modeling, hours unwrapping,
Hours texturing. Don't rush the final 5 minutes. A good presentation can be the difference between someone scrolling past your artwork and someone stopping to study it. Everything is looking good now. The textures are reading nicely, the materials feel balanced. The weathering isn't overpowering the design. The lighting is bringing out the height details beautifully. And the aircraft finally looks like a finished portfolio piece, rather than just a textured model. Now all that's left to do is hit render. I hope you enjoyed following this complete workflow from start to finish. If you've made it this far, let me know in the comments what part of the process you enjoyed the most. Modeling, UVs, baking, texturing, or rendering. I genuinely love to hear which stage is your favorite. Also, if you learned something new or picked up even one workflow tip that you'll use in your own projects, let me know that as well. Reading your comments really helps me understand what you'd like to see in future tutorials. And one final question before you go, what would you like me to create next? Another vehicle? A stylized prop? A full environment? Or maybe a character workflow? Drop your suggestions below, because they might inspire the next tutorial. Thanks for following along, and I'll see you in the next one.